Thought Media Network proudly presents a weekly exploration of various spiritual practices with renowned spiritual authors, coaches, teachers, and Dr. Tracy Brown, RScP.
And now, here's Tracy.
Hey everybody, Tracy Brown here, and it is Poetry, Prayer, and Practice. Thanks for joining today. Every week we look at and talk about and think about different topics related to spiritual practice, poetry, and the spiritual elements of poetry, and of course, prayer. And today we're going to focus on spiritual practice. I recently was looking for a book on one of my many bookshelves, and the book, The Diamond in Your Pocket, Discovering Your True Radiance by Gangaji, just kind of dropped into my hands, and I realized I had not picked this book up in probably 8 to 10 years, but I love this book. So when I was looking for something else and found this book, I pulled it out and just started opening to random pages and reading a little bit and thinking and reflecting about what I had read. And a few days ago, I was reading the chapter 21, which is titled Spiritual Practice. And so I thought this would be something to really share as part of Poetry, Prayer, and Practice, because it's a great perspective on spiritual practices. What is spiritual practice? What are spiritual practices? And so I'm going to read some of it and we'll talk about it. If this is your first time with the Poetry, Prayer, and Practice show, then I want to encourage you to please put your comments and questions in the chat. If you are a regular, then you already know you can drop comments in the chat. You can just say hello and tell us where you are viewing from. And if whether you're someone who has watched many times or are new to the show, please consider making a donation to New Thought Media Network, that is the host for this show and so much other fabulous programming that allows us to put our new thought philosophy and understanding into action in our lives and in the world. So again, the book is The Diamond in Your Pocket. And the subtitle is Discovering Your True Radiance. And if you're not familiar with Gangaji, here's some of the comments that are in the book jacket. Gangaji, the American-born teacher who has influenced the lives of thousands of people through her retreats and public events, helps us to reconcile the observations and questions that arise along the spiritual path. Like a precious gem, the diamond in your pocket cuts through what is false and illuminates what is true. A brilliant series of contemplations and insights you will want to hold dear and return to again and again. And I agree with that. That's why the book is still on my shelf, even though I'm sure it's been 8 to 10 years before I actually sat and read the book all the way through. And every time I do go through the shelf and cull some of the books that I'm ready to let go of, this one continues to stay on my shelf. So some of the chapters in the book, in part 1, It's the invitation, discovering the truth of who you are. This book is in 4 different parts. Part 1 is the invitation, discovering the truth of who you are, and it's the first 15 chapters. Then in part 2, beyond the mind, deeper than emotion. And there are about 10 chapters in that section, and the chapter on spiritual practice comes from this section. The third section is unraveling the knot of suffering. And when I first purchased this book, I found myself very attracted to the, I don't know, it's about 15 chapters there in this section, because it really breaks down suffering and the difference between pain and suffering, and the difference between being a victim and suffering, or, taking responsibility and suffering. And then the fourth section is choosing peace. And there are about 14 chapters there. So the book is not huge. So when I'm saying they're chapters, I mean, totally, there are 55 different chapters. They are not, in general, very long. There are a few exceptions, but they're not very long. And Gangaji is just brilliant. So that's a little bit of an overview if you're not familiar with Gangaji or with this book. Let's dive into the chapter on spiritual practice. It's chapter 21. So I invite you to just take it in and reflect on it and think about how what Gangaji has written, how does it resonate with you? Does it reflect what you think of as spiritual practice? Do you have questions about what is described as spiritual practice? And I acknowledge that I have just come back into the country with a little bit of a chest cold. I didn't think that it was going to flare up as I am talking, but I'm good. I'm good. So do not worry. Do not get distracted. I may cough here and there, but we are going to talk about spiritual practice. Chapter 21, spiritual practice. Many of the people I encounter sincerely want to realize the truth of their being. They ask me, what do I do? How do I do that? Paradoxically, this desire for true freedom finally can only be realized if you don't do anything to realize it. There are practices where you do mantras, visualizations, prostrations, or some kind of selfless service. They are all designed to still the mind so that it is not obsessing on what is needed to reveal true fulfillment. Practices are excellent for honing the capacity of the mind, both to focus and to surrender. Repeating. Practices are excellent for honing the capacity of the mind, both to focus and to surrender. Let us acknowledge that our spiritual practices have served us, that they are gifts from masters who have come before us. But let us also recognize that the truth of who we are is here now, and that all our practices have been ways of searching for what is already here, ways of trying to clear a path back to our own hearts. Now, I love that. I love the sentence that I repeated, that spiritual practices hone the capacity of the mind to focus, and also hone the capacity of our minds to surrender, right? To be in focus, but to also surrender, like to recognize that we may not be in control of everything. And then the last sentence on that page, our practices have been ways of searching for what is already here, of trying to clear a path back to our own hearts. Don't you just love that? Like we're going back to our own hearts. And our hearts are pure, our hearts are clear. And so often we let our thinking get in the way of what is truly at the heart of our lives. And so Gangaji reminds us that spiritual practices serve a purpose, but they're not magic, right? They're not magic tools. They are simply using and shaping our capacity to know ourselves, to know our true selves. Continuing. The problem is that finally, any attempt to go somewhere implies that you are not already there. In fact, any activity you undertake to achieve this is an obstruction to the deepest recognition of what has always been fully realized. In this moment, you can realize what does not need to be practiced to exist. This is the easiest, simplest, and most obvious truth. What has kept it a secret throughout the ages is its absolute simplicity and its immediate availability. This simplicity is difficult because we are taught from childhood that to achieve something, we have to learn what the steps are and then practice them. This works beautifully for any number of things. The mind is an exquisite learning tool. But self-realization, as well as the deepest inspiration and creativity, come directly from the source of the mind. Realization does not come from any doing. It comes from surrendering the mind to the source. So just take that in for a minute, remembering that the source is the source. And really, what we're doing with spiritual practices, we're getting out of the way. We're not earning points, right? We're not like going to a class where you have to climb up to step one and then learn to go to step two and then step three and step four in a sequential process that leads to the exact same result for everyone, because the answer is actually already existing and existent. So this reminder that Gangaji gives us is that it's really very simple. And I just laugh when I read, what has kept it a secret throughout the ages is its absolute simplicity and its immediate availability. Leave it to us as human beings to make it more complicated. We get our we get our brains involved and we start thinking about all the different possibilities, and we then make it way harder than it needs to be. I also like the reminder in this section that any activity you undertake to achieve this is actually an obstruction to the deepest recognition of what has always been fully realized. So our spiritual practices give us the opportunity to realize the innate truth, the truth of the source of life, to open the door and to help us get out of the way, which then also goes right back to what was in one of the first paragraphs. Practices are excellent for honing the capacity of the mind both to focus and to surrender. So that's what we're doing with our spiritual practices. We're teaching ourselves to focus and to surrender. I'm returning to the text. If spiritual practices serve the purpose of stopping the mind, they are strong allies. But if they deepen the belief that you are someone in particular who practices something in particular in order to get something that you do not believe is already here, then they become an obstruction. They keep you spinning around yourself rather than allowing you to deepen into yourself. I'm reading that whole paragraph again because I need to hear it. And maybe it'll mean something to you too, but I need to take this one in. If spiritual practices serve the purpose of stopping the mind, they are strong allies. But if they deepen the belief that you are someone in particular who practices something in particular in order to get something that you do not believe is already here, then they are an obstruction. They keep you spinning around yourself rather than allowing you to deepen into yourself. I'm smiling because I'm hoping I'm not the only one that is just going into the depth of the soul as a beautiful reminder. Continuing, meditation means many different things to different people. It can mean focusing on the breath, or concentrating on an image, or any number of things. But the meditation practice perpetuated by most people in the world is this. I am these thoughts, I am these emotions. There may be breaks where some kind of formal meditation is practiced, but then it's back to the strongest practice. This is me. I am this body. These are my wants. This is what I want to have. This is what I don't have. And on and on. This is the meditation, and it is a meditation of suffering. Because it is so widespread, it is often overlooked. It is thought of not as a practice, but a reality. Now, I want to think about that just a little bit because I do believe that often we are meditating about what we don't want. We are using meditation unconsciously, focused on what we want to change, what's not working, what we are suffering about. And it's a mantra in our head, right? About who we want to be, who we're becoming, what we want, what we don't want. And we're not actually meditating from a spiritually grounded place, but it is a meditation. It's the mantra we repeat over and over, either consciously or subconsciously. And when I ask people about meditation, they think, oh, I'm meditating. I go sit on my mat and I breathe deeply and I clear my mind of distractions. But in so many ways, the other, 18 waking hours beyond the 30 minutes of meditation is meditating because we're focusing our brain and our thinking and our beliefs on what we don't want. And I don't often think about that as meditation. But when I read this, it reminds me that it is. It is a form of meditation. She goes on to write, there are exquisite moments when the usual meditation stops, moments of being absorbed in a lover's embrace, in the sound of beautiful music, or in the colors of a sunrise. These are moments where there is no you being practiced. There is simply beingness. And in this simple beingness, there are peace, insight, clarity, and naturalness, and effortless grace and ease of being. But we believe strongly in our me meditation. And so there are usually just brief moments before the normal practice of me thinking is picked up again. I am this body. This is who I am. You are that body. That is who you are. This is my culture. That is your culture. These are my beliefs. Those are your beliefs. You are my enemy. You are my friend. You want something from me. I want something from you, etc. I would never discourage anyone from taking breaks from this usual practice of suffering, whether these breaks are found in what is called spiritual practice, or are found in dancing, or listening to music, or found being in nature, or lying in a hammock. The truth of who you are, however, is simpler than anything that can be practiced. Personal suffering, on the other hand, is very complex. And for it to continue, it must be practiced. If you are suffering, just as an investigation, see if you are practicing your suffering. Okay, so I don't know. I may just need to stop right there because in this chapter about spiritual practice, Gangaji really keeps hitting home on the practice that most of us unconsciously, subconsciously are using and applying throughout our day. And that is the practice of being spiritually not enough, the practice of not seeing our true self, the practice of beating ourselves up or complaining, or as she writes, suffering. The belief in suffering is what we are practicing. The belief in having to work to do something a specific way to be judged well or positively, we practice responding to that. It is what guides our words and our actions. And so I love this opportunity and this reminder that it doesn't have to be that complicated. And sometimes the most powerful spiritual practice is the simply being rather than doing. Being rather than doing. Since we are so conditioned and attuned to define who we are by particular activities, we spend our lives overlooking the vast ground of stillness that is the simplicity of being. When I speak of the heart, I'm speaking of this same being. When I speak of the core of every phenomenon, being is what I am referring to. When I speak of what is meant in self inquiry, I am also speaking of being, whether it is emotional self inquiry, such as meeting fear, anger, despair, or mental self inquiry, such as inquiring into the actual I thought. To inquire fully into anything is to discover this vast, simple presence of being yourself as you are. Being is not a practice. A practice involves some technique, a right way and a wrong way, a belief in getting someplace, and a reward or attainment. In the truth of absolute stillness, none of that applies. Okay, yes, I'm going to, no surprise to most of you, I am going to repeat that short but very powerful paragraph. Being is not a practice. A practice involves some technique, a right way and a wrong way, a belief in getting someplace, and a reward or attainment. In the truth of absolute stillness, none of that applies. Wow. So, Gangaji, and if there's someone who's just joined us, we're exploring what Gangaji wrote about spiritual practice in the book, The Diamond in Your Pocket, Discovering Your True Radiance by Gangaji. And this chapter is so helpful in the context of poetry, prayer, and practice because most of the time we are talking about specific practices you can do, a system you can use, a way to integrate some series of behaviors or patterns of behavior into your life in order to maintain your spiritual groundedness. And Gangaji challenges that idea by reminding us that if we think it is the practice that is actually earning our ascendance, then we shouldn't be doing it. When we recognize it as an ally to train ourselves to do what she writes in the very first part of the chapter, to create the capacity, to hone the capacity of the mind to both focus and surrender, then the practices or spiritual practices are really helpful because we are training ourselves to be, not to do. But if we are using spiritual practices as either a crutch or as a giving us a false sense of achievement, it is then when we are actually participating in the practice of suffering, or we're participating in the practice of something that is not really spiritual practice. It is more a human controlling of experience or an attempt to humanly control the experience or the expression of our lives. So, I don't know. What are you thinking about this? Is it making any sense to you? I'm just going to highlight one or two other things, and then I'm going to encourage you to just reflect on some of this in your own life. She writes, all of the holiest scriptures, texts, and practices come from truth and point back to truth. But there has to be a moment where you leap back into yourself. And that leap happens only right now, when you are naked of everything but yourself, when you are innocent of what you have learned about who you are. Another question I'm often asked is, how do I remain in a state of being stopped? But stopped is not a state. Neither silence nor stillness is a state. This is a very important distinction. You can get your mind into a state of relative calm, and you can get your body to relax. But the stillness I am referring to is, by its very nature, always still. It is always stopped. All mental movement, all doing appears, exists, and it disappears back into this stateless stillness. A state has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There are happy states and sad states, altered and mundane states, high and low states. But the stateless presence of being is stillness. Awareness is stillness. Who you already are is this stillness. Your mind may be active with thoughts, thoughts about activity, or thoughts about trying to stop, but that is all occurring in the statelessness of being, which is stillness itself. So, the last sentence in this chapter reads like this. The only thing that separates you from recognizing the truth of who you are as eternal stillness is following some thought that says you are not that. Repeating, the only thing that separates you from recognizing the truth of who you are as eternal stillness is following some thought that says you are not that. So, on poetry prayer practice, right, we've spent some shows really focusing on poetry and some focused on prayer and a lot focused on spiritual practice. But I love this reminder from Gangaji that the spiritual practice is not the pathway. You know, it's not a magic pathway. It's not the yellow brick road that if you turn this corner, or if you know exactly what you're doing to achieve something, that it is going to work. This chapter reminds us that our spiritual practice is only effective when we understand we are using it as a tool, as a process to both unleash the best of us and surrender to that which is the best of us, which is already existent. We're not aspiring to become something. We are using spiritual practice as a way to train ourselves to simply be, to be that eternal existence that is expressing itself as each one of us. And that's a really big distinction between I need to learn a spiritual practice and do it exactly the way that my teacher did it and memorize the words that my teacher used, and then for 6.5 minutes every morning and 14.9 minutes every evening, I must do this way. So I earn my way to self-understanding, or I earn my way to being spiritually grounded. That's not the purpose. That would be practicing suffering. That would be practicing some form that we have created versus relaxing into and allowing the truth of who we are to experience this life. And that we do that and notice, just notice the perfection that unfolds, whether it is within us or through us, or a part of the experience that we create, whether it is seeing the sunrise and knowing that that sunrise is nature expressing, and nature is also expressing as me, right? So I hope that there's something in the Gangaji reading that really resonated with you and gives you something to think about during the coming week. And we will be back next week on Poetry, Prayer, and Practice with a conversation about poetry or prayer. It'll be one of those two since we did practices today. My name is Tracy Brown, and I'm really so glad that you joined me today, and I hope that you will join me again next Tuesday or in a future Tuesday for Poetry, Prayer, and Practice right here on the New Thought Media Network.
Thanks for watching. Join us again next week, or watch on demand at www.ntmedia.org or youtube.com/New Thought Media Network. New Thought Media Network, positively inspiring. Learn more at www.ntmedia.org.
On behalf of everyone at New Thought Media Network, thank you for being a member of our virtual family. Your financial contributions help share the New Thought message with people from around the world. Please visit and contribute at www.ntmedia.org/donate. New Thought